My ex-husband stood in family court, impeccably attired in a bespoke Italian suit, dabbing away pre-timed crocodile tears. He informed the judge that our son was pleading to live with him. He accused me of being bankrupt, mentally unstable, and entirely unfit to mother. However, when the judge turned to my 11-year-old son and posed the question of truth, my son did not weep or falter. He simply rose, retrieved his phone from his pocket, and initiated playback of a secret recording made the previous night. What reverberated through that hushed courtroom caused the judge to freeze entirely and obliterated the smug grin from my ex-husband's face. My name is Natalie. I am 34 years old, and for the past 3 years, I have allowed my ex-husband to believe he had utterly crushed me. I work as an interior stager, or at least, that is what I have led his affluent family to believe. The mahogany-paneled walls of the family courthouse felt chilly and formidable that Tuesday morning. I sat at the defendant's table, hands neatly folded in my lap, dressed in a plain beige blouse and slacks. Across the aisle at the plaintiff's table sat Bradley, my 36-year-old ex-husband, exuding a magazine cover perfection in his dark navy suit. Beside him was his new wife, Sienna, 28, adorned in a tailored white dress that spoke volumes of old money, despite her being merely an internet influencer who had married into his family's fortune. Judge Ramirez, a 60-year-old woman known for her absolute intolerance of liars, peered over her glasses at the documents before her. "Your Honor," Bradley began, his voice quivering with calculated emotion, "I take no pleasure in being here today, but I must protect my son. Natalie is completely broke. She moves from one cheap apartment to another, struggling to find odd jobs arranging furniture. She is mentally unstable, erratic, and deeply depressed. Just last night, Leo called me in tears. He begged me to save him. He wishes to live with Sienna and me permanently." Sienna reached over, placing a manicured hand on Bradley's shoulder, offering the judge a look of profound maternal sorrow. "We simply want to provide the boy with a stable, loving home," she whispered, loud enough for the court reporter to capture. "He needs a real mother figure." I remained impassive. I did not cry out or accuse them of falsehoods. My gaze remained fixed on my son, Leo, who sat quietly beside my lawyer. Leo was 11, but possessed the quiet wisdom of a 30-year-old. A reserved, observant child who had witnessed far too much of his father's cruelty behind closed doors. Judge Ramirez sighed deeply, her gaze upon me a mixture of pity and sternness. "Ms. Natalie, these are very serious allegations. If you cannot provide proof of stable income and housing today, I will have no choice but to grant emergency temporary custody to the father." She paused, her tone softening as she leaned forward. "But before we delve into financial disclosures, I wish to hear from the child. Leo, sweetheart, you do not need to be afraid. Did you tell your father you wanted to live with him? Is your mother unable to care for you?" Bradley turned to face Leo, casting a sharp, warning glare. It was the same look he used to give me during our marriage, the look that signaled repercussions if I strayed from the path. Leo rose. He was wearing his favorite green sweater, appearing so small in the cavernous courtroom. Yet, his eyes were utterly steady. "No, Your Honor," Leo stated clearly. "I never said that. My dad is lying." Bradley shot from his chair. "Your Honor, the boy is clearly being manipulated. Natalie has brainwashed him." "Sit down, Mr. Bradley," Judge Ramirez commanded, her gavel striking the sounding block with a sharp crack. "Let the boy speak." Leo slowly tapped his small smartphone screen. Bradley's arrogant, confident smirk vanished instantly. The audio, though slightly muffled, was undeniably clear. My ex-husband's harsh, aggressive voice filled the vast courtroom. "Tomorrow, you tell the judge you hate your mother, or I'll call the bank and have her evicted from that trashy apartment. I will make sure she starves on the street." You will tell them she is crazy, or I swear to God, I will cut off your health insurance, and you can both rot. Do you understand me? Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to stand up to family who underestimated your worth. The absolute silence in the courtroom lasted mere seconds before Bradley's attorney, a man whose custom-tailored suit likely cost more than my first car, cleared his throat loudly. He appeared utterly unfazed. Instead, he let out a loud, patronizing chuckle that echoed off the mahogany walls. Unbuttoning his jacket, he strolled casually to the center of the room, shaking his head as if observing a child's cheap magic trick. "Your Honor," he began, gesturing dismissively toward Leo and me, "this is precisely the type of erratic, highly disturbing behavior my client was warning you about. What we just heard on that phone is nothing more than a desperate fabrication. It is an AI deepfake created by a bitter woman who refuses to accept reality and let go of her wealthy ex-husband." The attorney then paced directly in front of our table, pointing an accusatory finger at my face. "My client is a respected tech entrepreneur. He does not threaten children. The mother, however, is currently unemployed. She claims to be a freelance interior stager, but we have pulled her public records, and she has not had a single verified client in over 6 months. She sits in her rented low-income apartment, playing on her computer, manufacturing fake digital audio clips to extort my client. It is a pathetic, terrifying attempt to weaponize her own child because she knows she cannot provide for him financially or emotionally." Before Judge Ramirez could even process the lawyer's audacious claim, Sienna sprang from her chair like an actress stepping onto a stage, clasping her diamond ring-adorned hands over her chest, her face contorted into a flawless mask of pure agony. "Your Honor, please," she cried out, her voice breaking perfectly. "I cannot sleep at night worrying about this sweet boy. We did not want to air her dirty laundry in public, but she forced our hand. We have proof." She clutched a thick, heavy manila envelope from the plaintiff's table and rushed frantically toward the bench. The court bailiff immediately stepped forward to intercept her, but the judge waved him off, allowing Sienna to approach. With a highly dramatic flourish, Sienna dumped a massive stack of glossy 8x10 photographs directly onto the judge's desk. "Look at these," Sienna sobbed, dabbing a completely dry eye and glancing back at the gallery to ensure everyone was witnessing her performance. "Look at how she treats her own son." I craned my neck slightly to see the images scattered across the polished wood. They were entirely fabricated. Heavily manipulated pictures depicted a woman who vaguely resembled me, stumbling out of a seedy dive bar at 2 a.m. Another photo showed my current apartment building with a digital timestamp of midnight, claiming I had left Leo completely alone in a dangerous neighborhood while I went out partying with strangers. The Photoshop work was passable enough to fool an untrained eye at first glance, rendering me as a disheveled, reckless mess. "We hired a private investigator," Sienna lied smoothly, returning to Bradley's side and grasping his arm for support. "He took these last week. She leaves Leo completely unattended in that tiny, roach-infested apartment. She spends whatever meager child support Bradley provides on alcohol and nightlife. She is an unfit mother, Your Honor. Leo deserves our sprawling estate, where he has his own private bedroom, a personal tutor, and a mother figure who actually stays home to care for him properly." Bradley nodded gravely, playing the role of the deeply concerned, wealthy father to absolute perfection. "I just want my son safe, Your Honor," he said, his voice thick with feigned paternal emotion. "She is highly unstable. I am offering him a life of immense privilege, absolute security, and endless love. She is offering him a life of crushing poverty and dangerous neglect. You must grant me emergency physical custody right now, today, before she does something drastic that gets my boy hurt." Judge Ramirez slowly picked up the scattered photographs. Her expression, which had softened briefly when Leo played his recording, now hardened into unyielding granite. She scrutinized the glossy images, her jaw clenching tightly. Family court judges encounter terrible, tragic situations daily, and the mere suggestion of child abandonment was enough to send a chill down her spine. She meticulously stacked the photos and locked her piercing brown eyes onto me. The temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. "Ms. Natalie," Judge Ramirez stated, her voice dropping an octave, carrying a dangerous, heavy weight. "The Family Court of New York does not take allegations of child abandonment lightly, nor do we look kindly upon the manufacturing of digital evidence to manipulate custody proceedings. Your ex-husband and his wife have presented documented claims regarding your highly questionable lifestyle and your complete financial ruin. They've painted a picture of a mother who can't even keep the lights on, let alone raise a child in a safe, healthy environment." The judge leaned forward, clasping her hands tightly on the towering wooden desk. "I will afford you one opportunity to address these severe allegations. I require immediate, documented proof of your current employment, certified tax returns, recent bank statements, and irrefutable evidence of a safe living environment. If you cannot produce undeniable hard evidence of your financial stability here and now, I will sign the emergency order granting full custody to the father before you can even exit these double doors. Do you understand me?" My court-appointed attorney shifted nervously, his hands trembling as he reached for his worn briefcase. But I placed a calm, steady hand on his wrist, halting his search. I did not panic. I did not cry out that the photos were fake or that Sienna was a pathological liar. I simply looked across the aisle at Bradley, who was struggling to suppress a massive, triumphant grin. He genuinely believed he had me cornered. He truly thought his family's wealth, his expensive lawyer, and a few fabricated pictures were finally enough to break my spirit and steal my child. I turned my gaze back to the judge's stern face. The suffocating pressure of the courtroom, the dire threat of losing my son, the vicious coordinated deception, none of it fazed me in the slightest. I casually reached into my designer leather tote bag, a bag Bradley had always assumed was a cheap flea market knockoff, and retrieved a thick, heavily sealed corporate folder. I looked directly at my ex-husband and allowed a slow, icy smile to spread across my face. It was the exact kind of calm, terrifying smile that made Bradley's victorious grin vanish instantly. "Your Honor," I began, my voice carrying clearly across the silent room. "Before I reveal the contents of this folder, I need to explain precisely why my ex-husband rushed into this courtroom today. This entire charade was not born out of a sudden concern for my son. It was meticulously orchestrated exactly 72 hours ago, on Thanksgiving evening." Bradley shifted uncomfortably in his leather chair, his eyes darting toward his lawyer. The judge folded her hands and nodded, signaling me to continue. 72 hours prior, I continued, I had driven Leo out to Bradley's sprawling family estate to drop him off for the holiday weekend. It's a massive, cold monstrosity of stone and glass, hidden behind imposing iron gates. I pulled my modest sedan up the winding driveway, parking behind a line of expensive imported sports cars. Leo sat in the passenger seat, clutching his overnight bag, looking absolutely terrified to go inside. I kissed his forehead and promised him I would pick him up on Sunday. I walked him up the grand, sweeping stone steps, but before I could even ring the bell, the heavy mahogany front door swung open. It wasn't Bradley waiting to greet his son. It was his older sister, Caroline. She stood there, clad in a designer silk dress and holding a crystal glass of expensive wine, looking down her nose at me the way she always did. She physically blocked the grand entryway, refusing to let me step even 1 foot inside the house. "Don't bother cutting your engine, Natalie," Caroline sneered, taking a slow sip of her wine. "Just drop the boy and get off the property. We have guests arriving, and we don't want them seeing the hired help lingering in the driveway. I ignored her pathetic insult and gently pushed Leo forward. Have a good weekend, buddy, I whispered. As Leo slipped past her into the house, Caroline suddenly stepped forward and violently shoved a thick, heavy manila envelope directly into my chest. I instinctively caught it to prevent it from hitting the ground. I looked down at the bold, black lettering stamped across the top. It was an emergency custody petition. We have tolerated your trashy upbringing and your embarrassing poverty for far too long, Natalie, Caroline hissed, her voice dripping with pure venom. 10 years ago, you trapped my brother to get a piece of our family money, but now he has Sienna. He has a proper wife who comes from a proper background. You are nothing but a broke freelance nobody who can't even pay her own rent. We are taking the boy permanently. You have until Tuesday to say goodbye. I stood there on the cold stone porch, holding the thick stack of legal threats. Peering past Caroline's shoulder into the grand marble foyer, I saw Caroline's husband, Terrence, standing in the background near the grand staircase. He is a tall, distinguished African-American man who works as a highly respected corporate consultant. Over the years, I had always noted that Terrence carried a quiet, heavy dignity that completely contrasted with the vile, toxic nature of his wife's family. Terrence stood perfectly still, his hands shoved deep into the pockets of his tailored slacks. His jaw was clenched so tightly I could see a muscle feathering in his cheek. He was watching his wife verbally assault me in front of our son. He did not say a single word. He did not intervene. But his dark eyes were locked onto mine, and the absolute disgust radiating from his face was impossible to miss. He hated this family just as much as I did. Caroline let out a cruel, condescending laugh, expecting me to break down crying right there on her doorstep. She expected me to fall to my knees and beg her to reconsider. She expected me to act like the weak, defeated woman they had always accused me of being. Instead, I slowly folded the heavy legal document perfectly in half. I looked up and met Caroline's smug, triumphant gaze. I did not shed a single tear. I did not raise my voice or reveal even an ounce of fear. You really shouldn't play games you can't afford to finish, Caroline, I told her, my voice completely dead and flat. Arrogance is a very expensive luxury, and your family is completely out of credit. I turned my back on her, leaving her standing on the porch with a confused frown forming on her perfectly powdered face. I walked calmly down the steps, got into my car, and drove away into the cold November night, knowing exactly what I was going to do next. I brought my focus back to the present moment inside the courtroom. I looked directly at Judge Ramirez and placed my hands firmly on the heavy corporate folder I had just retrieved from my bag. They ambushed me on Thanksgiving, Your Honor, I stated firmly. They handed me those fake custody papers and threatened to bury me in legal fees because they genuinely believed I was just a struggling interior stager. They believed they could crush me with their wealth. I opened the folder, I explained to the judge, keeping my voice perfectly steady. But what Bradley and his family don't know is that I don't arrange furniture for a living, and I'm far from broke. Before I hand these financial documents to the bailiff, there's one more crucial detail about that Thanksgiving night you need to understand. I paused, letting the weight of my words settle. Because while Caroline was busy threatening me on the front porch, she failed to notice what was happening right behind her. As I had turned to walk down the sweeping stone steps, I realized my gray wool scarf had slipped from my shoulder and fallen onto the frost-covered ground. I stopped and turned back to retrieve it. But the heavy mahogany front door opened again. It wasn't Caroline this time. It was Terrence. He stepped out into the freezing night air, leaving the warmth and the loud, arrogant laughter of his wife's family behind him. He picked up my scarf and walked slowly down the long driveway toward my parked car, the crisp autumn leaves crunching beneath his expensive leather shoes. When he reached me, he didn't offer a fake holiday greeting or try to make excuses for his wife's vicious behavior. He simply handed me the scarf. His dark eyes held a profound weight, a mixture of exhaustion and silent solidarity. "They are going to play incredibly dirty," Terence told me, his voice barely above a whisper so his words wouldn't carry back to the house. "Bradley is desperate, and desperate men do terrible things. Do not let them break you." I took the scarf and nodded. "I will not," I promised him. Terence gave me a single firm nod of respect. It was the only moment of genuine human decency I had ever experienced on that property. He turned and walked back into the lion's den. But what happened next inside that house was something I only learned about later, when my brave 11-year-old son finally returned to me. I continued. According to Leo, the moment Terence walked back inside the front door, Bradley finally made his grand appearance. He came marching down the grand sweeping staircase, but he didn't rush to hug the son he claimed to love so desperately. He didn't ask Leo how his car ride was, or if he was excited for Thanksgiving dinner. Instead, Bradley marched straight up to his own child, grabbed him harshly by the upper arm, and dragged him away from the rest of the family. Bradley pulled Leo down a long, dimly lit hallway and shoved him inside his private, mahogany-paneled study. It was a massive, intimidating room filled with expensive leather furniture and walls of unread books meant to make Bradley look like a scholar. Bradley slammed the heavy wooden door shut, cutting off all the noise from the holiday party outside. He wanted complete privacy. He wanted to ensure there were absolutely no witnesses to the psychological torture he was about to inflict on a child. But my son is incredibly smart. He is. He has spent his entire childhood watching his father manipulate and gaslight everyone around him. Leo knew exactly what that cold look in his father's eyes meant. So, as Bradley was busy turning the heavy brass lock on the study door, Leo slipped his small hand into the pocket of his jeans. With his heart pounding in his chest, he blindly swiped his thumb across his phone screen and pressed the record button on his audio application. He captured every single second of the nightmare that followed. Bradley loomed over our son, his face twisted with rage. He pointed a threatening finger directly at Leo's chest and delivered the exact monologue the entire courtroom had just listened to. He told Leo that he had to stand in front of a judge and lie under oath. He threatened to call the bank and have me thrown out onto the street. He threatened to cancel Leo's health insurance. He promised to make us both starve if Leo did not follow his exact script. "Do we have an understanding, boy?" Bradley had hissed, his voice dripping with pure malice. Leo, terrified but holding his ground, silently nodded his head. Satisfied that he had completely terrified a child into submission, Bradley unlocked the door and led him back to the dining room to eat turkey and pretend they were a picture-perfect family. The courtroom was dead silent as I finished recounting the events of that night. I looked away from the judge and locked my eyes directly onto Bradley. He was sinking lower into his expensive leather chair, his face pale and sweating. He knew the narrative was entirely slipping out of his control. "That is the man who claims he wants to provide a stable, loving home, Your Honor," I said, my voice echoing with absolute authority. "That is the man who accused me of being an unfit mother. But as you are about to see, the only thing Bradley is trying to protect today is his own fraudulent lifestyle." Before I could slide my corporate folder across the polished wood of the judge's bench, Bradley's high-priced attorney leaped out of his chair. "Objection, Your Honor!" he practically shouted, waving his hands in the air to break the momentum I had just built. "The defendant is attempting to distract this court from the actual issue at hand by dragging us into a dramatic storytelling session about a holiday party. We are not here to discuss family disagreements. We are here to discuss the imminent danger to a child's physical and financial well-being." The attorney didn't even wait for Judge Ramirez to rule on his outburst. He snatched a thick, stapled packet from his leather briefcase and marched directly toward the bench. He moved with the desperate, aggressive energy of a man who is being paid an exorbitant amount of money to win at any cost. Your Honor, I have right here a certified financial inquiry pulled just yesterday morning, the attorney declared, his voice booming with artificial authority. He slapped the packet down in front of the judge. This court needs to look at the cold, hard facts. Natalie is not just struggling, she is completely drowning. She has defaulted on multiple high-interest loans and maxed out an endless string of credit cards trying to keep her pathetic interior staging business afloat. My court-appointed lawyer shifted nervously again, practically sweating through his cheap suit. But I kept my eyes completely locked on Bradley's attorney, watching him perform his expensive theatrical routine. According to these records, the attorney stated, emphasizing every single syllable for maximum dramatic effect, the mother is currently over $500,000 in debt. $500,000, Your Honor. These are not mere allegations. These are sworn statements from collection agencies. She has shell accounts, she has hidden penalties, and she is facing imminent litigation from 3 separate banks. Her rented apartment is 30 days away from being seized. She is backed into a terrifying financial corner, and that makes her incredibly dangerous. That is why she manufactured that fake audio recording of my client. She is trying to extort him to pay off her massive debts because she is a sinking ship. Judge Ramirez picked up the packet. Her thick silver eyebrows drew together in a tight, severe knot. I knew exactly what she was looking at because I knew exactly how Bradley operated. He had paid someone a lot of money to forge those documents. He had taken the small business loan I had co-signed for him years ago during our marriage, the one he swore he had paid off, and manipulated the paperwork to make it look like I was the sole guarantor of a massive, ballooning debt. The papers looked incredibly authentic, featuring official-looking bank logos, notarized stamps, and complex spreadsheets mapping out a fictional history of financial ruin. The courtroom grew so quiet you could hear the hum of the air conditioning vents. Sienna let out a soft, theatrical gasp, covering her mouth in faked horror. "Oh my God," she whispered loudly enough for the gallery to hear. "That poor boy is living in absolute squalor." I turned my head slightly and looked at Bradley. He was leaning back in his expensive leather chair, looking completely relaxed. He caught my eye and offered a sickeningly triumphant smirk. He leaned forward, resting his elbows on the heavy oak table, and mouthed 3 words directly at me. "You are nothing." It was the same exact phrase he used to whisper to me in the dark when we were married. It was his favorite weapon, designed to make me feel small, powerless, and entirely dependent on his family's wealth. He genuinely believed that this forged piece of paper was the final nail in my coffin. He thought he had successfully painted me as a desperate, broke, and unhinged woman who was entirely unfit to raise a child. The judge took off her reading glasses and rubbed the bridge of her nose. The stern pity in her eyes was agonizing to witness. She looked at me with deep, extreme concern. "Your Honor," I said, my voice projecting clearly and calmly across the space. "Before you sign any emergency orders based on those entirely fabricated papers, I formally request permission to take the stand under oath and submit my actual certified financial disclosures." Bradley's attorney immediately jumped up to object, waving his hands frantically, but Judge Ramirez held up her hand to silence him. She was looking at me with a mix of curiosity and intense scrutiny. Given the extreme severity of the allegations, she granted my request without hesitation. I picked up my heavy leather folder and walked confidently across the well of the courtroom. I placed my right hand on the Bible, swore to tell the whole truth, and took my seat in the witness box. I was looking down directly at my ex-husband. I opened the folder and pulled out a thick stack of documents. These were not cheap photocopies or highly manipulated digital prints like the one Sienna had thrown on the bench. These were official legal papers bearing the raised embossed seals of the Internal Revenue Service and the undeniable watermarks of one of the largest corporate wealth management banks in the country. I handed the stack to the court bailiff, who immediately carried them up to the judge's towering wooden desk. The documents Mr. Bradley just presented to this court are a complete and total forgery, I stated, my voice completely unwavering. He took a small business loan that I co-signed for his failing tech company 7 years ago and maliciously altered the digital headers. He fabricated those collection notices to make it appear as though I am facing personal financial ruin. What the bailiff has just handed you, Your Honor, are my official tax transcripts for the last 5 consecutive years, along with my fully certified corporate asset portfolio. Judge Ramirez slid her reading glasses back down the bridge of her nose. She opened the first heavy folder. The courtroom was so unbelievably quiet that I could actually hear the thick, high-quality paper turning in her hands. I watched her eyes scan the top line of the IRS transcript. She paused, completely freezing in place. She blinked hard and pulled the paper slightly closer to her face, as if she could not quite believe what she was seeing. Then she quickly flipped to the second page, tracing her finger down a long column of numbers. The severe, deeply concerned expression she had worn just moments before completely vanished, replaced by a look of absolute, sheer shock. For the past 3 years since our divorce, I continued, keeping my icy gaze locked entirely onto Bradley's face, my ex-husband has loudly and repeatedly told everyone that I am a struggling, unemployed interior stager. He told his wealthy family, his friends, and even his new wife that I rely entirely on his meager child support checks to survive. I allowed him to believe that carefully crafted lie. I allowed his toxic sister to insult my clothing, my home, and my upbringing on Thanksgiving. I did this because his incredibly fragile ego required him to feel superior to me, and because I wanted absolute peace to rebuild my professional life without his constant financial abuse and manipulation. I leaned forward slightly, resting my hands on the polished wooden railing of the witness stand. But, I said, my voice now resonating with newfound strength, I do not arrange furniture for a living. I never have. I am the founder, chief executive officer, and 100% shareholder of Apex Commercial Holdings. The name of the company seemed to echo like a gunshot against the mahogany walls. Bradley's high-priced lawyer suddenly stopped shuffling his legal pads. He froze completely, his head snapping up to look at me. He instantly recognized the name. Anyone who operated in the corporate business sector in this city knew that name. We are a private commercial real estate firm, I explained to the court, maintaining my deadly calm demeanor. We acquire, develop, and manage high-value corporate properties across the entire eastern seaboard. I do not have a negative net worth. I am not facing eviction from a low-income apartment. The dilapidated residential address Bradley hired a private investigator to photograph is merely a small, empty shell property my firm uses for anonymous mail routing. As those certified banking documents and tax returns clearly confirm, my actual personal net worth is well over $40 million. I can provide for my son in ways my ex-husband could never even begin to comprehend. The entire courtroom went dead silent. It was a heavy, crushing vacuum of sound where no one even dared to breathe. Sienna dropped her designer handbag onto the floor with a loud thud, her jaw literally falling open as she stared at me in pure, unadulterated disbelief. Bradley's attorney sank slowly back down into his chair, looking at his client with the terrifying realization that he had just submitted forged legal documents against a multimillionaire. And Bradley, the arrogant, wealthy heir who had spent the last decade trying to make me feel completely worthless, sat utterly paralyzed at the plaintiff table. The smug, victorious smirk was wiped from his face, replaced by a sickeningly pale shade of gray. His worst nightmare had just come true. I was not the weak victim he thought I was. I was the one holding all the power. The absolute silence in the courtroom felt heavy enough to crush bone. Judge Ramirez kept her eyes locked on the official tax transcripts for a long time before she finally looked up. When she turned her gaze toward the plaintiff table, the anger radiating from her was palpable. She looked directly at Bradley's high-priced attorney, who was currently staring at his legal pad like he wanted the floor to swallow him whole. "Counsel," the judge said, her voice dangerously quiet. "You submitted documents to this court claiming the defendant was completely bankrupt. I am currently holding verified federal tax returns proving she is a multimillionaire. Do you have a death wish for your legal career? Or did your client intentionally provide you with fraudulent evidence?" The attorney stood up, completely abandoning his arrogant posture. He stammered, his face flushing a deep shade of crimson. "Your Honor, I assure you I received those financial documents directly from my client just yesterday. I had absolutely no prior knowledge of their fraudulent nature." Bradley realized his own lawyer was immediately throwing him under the bus. Panic finally began to crack through his carefully maintained mask of superiority. He shot up from his chair, waving his hands defensively. "Your Honor," he practically shouted, his voice pitching up in desperation. "That is not true. Her company must be a scam. It's a shell corporation. I run a legitimate business. I am the founder and chief executive of a highly innovative tech startup. We were just evaluated at $10 million. We occupy the entire 14th floor of the premium glass tower downtown. I have real assets. I provide real security for my son. She just plays around with dirty real estate." I sat perfectly still in the witness box, listening to him brag about his office space. This was exactly the moment I had been waiting for. I looked down at the heavy leather folder resting on my lap. I reached inside and pulled out a single thick document bound with a blue legal ribbon. I waited for Bradley to finish his frantic, desperate bragging before I spoke. "Your Honor," I said, projecting my voice clearly over Bradley's frantic rambling. "So," Judge Ramirez said, her voice still unnervingly calm. "If I understand correctly, Mr. Bradley's startup, which you claim is thriving and recently secured a massive new round of seed funding, is actually using investor money to fund your lifestyle brand and purchase promotional designer merchandise?" Sienna, beaming with misplaced confidence, nodded vigorously. "Exactly. He believes in my career, unlike her." She gestured wildly toward me, a smug, triumphant look briefly flashing across her face. Bradley, meanwhile, looked as though he was about to spontaneously combust. His face was a mottled crimson, his eyes wide and bulging with pure horror. His lawyer had all but dissolved into his chair, the picture of defeated resignation. "And this $200,000 transfer last week," the judge continued, her gaze fixed on Sienna, "was essentially seed money for your business from his company's new funding?" "Yes," Sienna declared, completely oblivious to the trap she was laying for herself. "It's proof of his success. He has plenty of money. He wouldn't transfer that much if he was broke." Judge Ramirez slowly turned her attention back to the eviction notice and financial ledger on her desk. A pained, almost sympathetic expression flickered across her face as she looked at the figures detailing Bradley's monumental debt. "Mr. Bradley," she said, her voice now carrying a palpable weight of authority, "your current wife has just testified under oath that you recently transferred $200,000 of what she claims is seed funding from your thriving startup to her personal account. However, the financial records I have here, pulled directly from the accounting department of Apex Commercial Holdings this morning, indicate that your company has not paid a single dime of commercial rent in 6 consecutive months. Furthermore, your primary investors pulled their funding last spring when your prototype failed, leaving your tech company with 0 incoming revenue, 0 operating capital, and absolutely no legitimate prospects." She paused, letting the implications of her words sink in. The silence in the courtroom was so profound, it felt like a physical pressure. "If," the judge continued, her voice now tinged with a dangerous edge, Your company is indeed thriving and has secured new funding, then the $200,000 you allegedly transferred to your wife would have to be from a source other than operational capital or investor funds, which leads me to believe, Ms. Miller, she addressed Sienna directly, that you are either mistaken about the source of those funds or that Mr. Bradley has a rather creative way of managing his finances that may very well venture into federal territory. Sienna's triumphant expression began to falter. Her eyes flickered between the judge and Bradley, a dawning comprehension slowly replacing her bravado. Your Honor, Bradley finally choked out, his voice raspy and desperate. She's confused. That money it was a personal loan, from my private savings. Ah, Judge Ramirez said, a small, almost imperceptible smile touching her lips. Your private savings? The same private savings that are supposedly entirely depleted, leaving you unable to pay your commercial rent for 6 months and facing imminent eviction from a building owned by the defendant? Bradley visibly sagged. His face was no longer crimson, it was a ghastly shade of white. Mr. Bradley, the judge continued, her voice hardening, you presented this court with forged documents, alleging that the defendant was financially ruined and unstable, when in fact, you were the one in significant financial distress, using a tenant's rent money to fund your wife's frivolous ventures. You have committed perjury and presented fraudulent evidence to this court, all while attempting to gain custody of your son. The seriousness of your actions is not lost on me. She then turned her gaze back to me. As for your request, Ms. Natalie, she said, her tone softening considerably. Given the evidence presented and the illuminating testimony of Mr. Bradley and his wife, I am revoking any consideration of an emergency temporary custody order granting physical placement to the father. Furthermore, I am issuing a full investigation into Mr. Bradley's financial dealings and the origin of the fraudulent documents presented to this court earlier today. A hearing will be scheduled to determine the full extent of his legal culpability and to finalize the custody arrangements for your son. The relief that washed over me was so powerful, I almost felt lightheaded. I met Leo's gaze. He was beaming, his eyes shining with pride. Sienna let out a strangled sob. But my clothing lines, my designer bags, my trip to Milan. Judge Ramirez closed her eyes briefly, taking a deep breath. Ms. Miller, she said wearily, I suggest you consult an attorney. It appears your husband's definition of thriving may be quite different from the standard definition, and your testimony has unfortunately provided ample evidence to that effect. She then turned to the bailiff. Please escort Mr. Bradley and Miss Miller from the courtroom. And Mr. Bradley, I would strongly advise you to remain available for further questioning by the relevant authorities. This is far from over. Hold on a moment, Judge Ramirez said, her voice cutting like a laser through the renewed tension. She picked up the prenuptial agreement the attorney had presented. Her eyes scanned the document, her expression unreadable. Mr. Smith, she addressed Bradley's attorney, while I appreciate your thoroughness, it seems we may have reached a slight misunderstanding regarding the timeline of events. She tapped a section of the document with her pen. This prenuptial agreement, she began, her voice even and measured, was indeed signed 3 months before the divorce decree was finalized. However, Apex Commercial Holdings as an entity and the acquisition of downtown properties that form its foundation were executed after the divorce decree was finalized. The properties were acquired via off-market cash transactions by Ms. Natalie as the sole principal of Apex Commercial Holdings on June 12, 2023. The divorce decree was finalized on April 5, 2023. Therefore, Apex Commercial Holdings and the assets it comprises were established entirely post-divorce. Bradley's smug smirk evaporated as quickly as it had appeared. his face drained of color once more, replaced by a look of utter disbelief. Sienna's greedy eyes narrowed in confusion. But it says here," the attorney stammered, pointing frantically at the prenuptial agreement, "that any financial asset created during the union is subject to equal division." "Yes," Judge Ramirez finished for him. "But the key word is created. Apex Commercial Holdings was not created during the union. It was established after the union was legally dissolved. Ms. Natalie's financial success, her ability to fund those acquisitions with cash, is a testament to her own achievements post-divorce. The funds used were from her personal and business accounts, entirely separate from any marital assets." She then pulled out a different document from her own file. "In fact," she continued, "as you will see from these certified bank statements and transaction logs from Apex Commercial Holdings, all funds used for the acquisitions, including the cash payment for the downtown tower, originated from Ms. Natalie's personal investment accounts, which were demonstrably established and funded well after the finalization of her divorce from Mr. Bradley." The attorney's jaw dropped. He looked at the documents, then back at the judge, his carefully constructed argument crumbling around him. "Furthermore," the judge added, her gaze returning to Bradley, "your wife's testimony regarding the misuse of investor funds meant for tech development to fund her lifestyle brand and alleged personal expenditures, such as designer handbags and first-class travel, is now a matter of extreme concern. The court reporter has meticulously recorded her confession. I will be forwarding a detailed transcript of that testimony, along with the financial records presented today, to the district attorney's office for immediate review for potential charges of corporate embezzlement and wire fraud." Bradley looked like he had aged 10 years in the span of 10 minutes. The last vestiges of hope extinguished from his eyes, he slumped back in his chair, defeated and exposed. Sienna, her face a mask of dawning horror, finally seemed to grasp the magnitude of her own words. The empire of lies she and Bradley had built was not just collapsing, it was being systematically dismantled by facts and legal precedent. "So," Judge Ramirez said, her voice now carrying a finality that echoed in the silent courtroom, "to be absolutely clear, Mr. Bradley, you have no claim to Apex Commercial Holdings. Your wife's testimony has placed you under investigation for federal crimes. And as for the custody of your son, Leo, given your current financial state, your documented dishonesty, and the potential for serious criminal charges, I find it difficult to see how granting you physical placement would be in his best interest." She looked at me, a flicker of respect in her eyes. "Ms. Natalie, your financial wherewithal and your clear demonstration of astute business acumen, entirely post-divorce, present a far more stable and secure environment for young Leo. The court will maintain its current order regarding his primary placement with you. The emergency custody motion filed by Mr. Bradley is hereby denied in its entirety." With a final, decisive rap of her gavel, Judge Ramirez adjourned the court. The sounds of shuffling feet, hushed, panicked whispers, and the stifled sobs of Sienna filled the void. Bradley sat frozen, a hollow shell of his former arrogant self. His parents, still red-faced with humiliation, had vanished from the gallery. I looked at Leo, who was now openly crying, but this time they were tears of relief and joy. He ran to me, burying his face in my side. "You did it, Mom," he whispered, his voice choked with emotion. "You saved us." I held him tight, the weight of the past 10 years finally lifting. The premium glass tower downtown, with its sweeping city views, was indeed mine. And more importantly, my son was safe. The skyline I had fought so hard for was now a symbol of my hard-won victory. Generate an image of a woman, dressed in a smart business suit, standing tall and confident in an opulent courtroom. She is holding a legal document, and her gaze is fixed on a man in a crumpled suit, who is slouched in his chair looking defeated. In the background, a judge sits behind a large bench, looking stern. The atmosphere should be one of triumph and justice served. Judge Ramirez watched the scene unfold with a mix of weary exasperation and grim satisfaction. The courtroom, moments ago filled with the high-stakes drama of legal maneuvering, had devolved into a raw, emotional spectacle. Ms. Rossi, the judge's voice cut through Sienna's furious accusations, sharp and commanding. While I understand your distress, this is still a court of law. Your emotional outburst, while perhaps understandable given the circumstances, is disruptive and reflects poorly on your own judgment. She gestured towards the shattered pitcher. Enough. This is a civil proceeding, not a domestic dispute. Mr. Bradley's financial ruin, and your entanglement in it, has been laid bare. The court has made its ruling. She turned her attention back to the legal documents, her face now a mask of bureaucratic finality. The prenuptial agreement is voided as of 2 years ago due to Mr. Bradley's declaration of personal bankruptcy. He forfeits any claim to Apex Commercial Holdings. The corporate embezzlement and wire fraud charges are now a matter for the district attorney's office. As for custody of young Leo, my previous ruling stands. He remains in the primary care of Ms. Natalie. Sienna, breathing heavily, slowly backed away from Bradley, her eyes blazing with a potent cocktail of betrayal and fury. She looked at him, the man who had painted a picture of an opulent future that was now revealed to be an elaborate, devastating lie. The designer bags, the first-class tickets, the very lifestyle she had paraded in court, all built on a foundation of deceit and ultimately worth nothing. Bradley, for his part, looked utterly and completely broken. The veneer of arrogance had crumbled entirely, leaving behind a desperate, pathetic figure. He made no move to defend himself against Sienna's rage, looking instead like a cornered rat. My lawyer, sensing the finality of the judge's pronouncements, calmly gathered his folders. A small, almost imperceptible nod passed between us. The exhaustion of the fight was immense, but the relief was even greater. As the bailiff began clearing the debris from the shattered pitcher, the weight of what had just transpired settled heavily. Sienna's screams had faded to choked sobs, a desolate sound in the suddenly quiet courtroom. Bradley sat in stunned silence, the $20 million dream dissolving into the harsh reality of financial ruin and legal repercussions. I stood from the witness box, Leo clinging to my hand. He looked up at me, his small face pale but his eyes steady. The ordeal had been terrifying, but he had seen his mother stand firm and emerge victorious. We walked out of the courtroom, leaving behind the wreckage of Bradley and Sienna's lives. The doors swung shut behind us, a definitive punctuation mark on a chapter that had been filled with deceit, manipulation, and ultimately, a fight for my son and my future. The city skyline, visible through the courtroom windows, now seemed to beckon with the promise of a genuine, untainted future. Generate an image depicting the aftermath of a courtroom scene. Broken glass and spilled water litter the floor near a long, polished wooden table. A woman in a designer outfit is hunched over, crying hysterically, her face buried in her hands. A man beside her, dressed in an expensive suit, looks pale and stunned, staring blankly ahead. In the background, a woman in a sharp suit stands tall, holding a young boy's hand, and they are walking towards the exit, bathed in a beam of sunlight from a distant window. The overall mood should convey a sense of dramatic resolution and individual triumph amidst chaos. Rage utterly consumed her. Sienna clenched her manicured hands into tight fists, launching into Bradley right there in the solemn courtroom. She repeatedly struck his shoulder and chest, her expensive diamond rings flashing under the harsh overhead fluorescent lights. "You ruined my life," she wailed, striking him harder with each word. "You used me to play a part in your pathetic charade. You called her crazy, but you are the absolute psycho." Bradley threw up his arms, attempting to shield his face from the onslaught of blows. "Stop this now," he yelled, trying to shove her away, but he was far too weak to overcome her frantic, adrenaline-fueled assault. His high-priced attorney scrambled from his chair, backing away towards the heavy wooden wall, completely abandoning his client to avoid the physical crossfire. The lawyer wanted no part of this escalating disaster, knowing his legal fees would never be paid. Judge Ramirez did not tolerate the violent outburst for more than a few seconds. "Bailiffs, separate them immediately," the judge roared, her voice echoing like thunder beneath the soaring mahogany ceiling. Two large uniformed court officers sprinted across the courtroom floor. One grabbed Sienna by the waist, lifting her bodily off the ground and pulling her firmly away from the plaintiff's table. The other stepped directly between them, placing a heavy hand on Bradley's chest, forcing him to remain seated. "Let me go!" Sienna shrieked, thrashing wildly against the bailiff's strong grip. Her pristine white designer dress was heavily wrinkled and stained with spilled water from the shattered pitcher. Her meticulously styled hair was a complete mess, falling into her tear-streaked face. She looked utterly unhinged, a stark contrast to the polished, elegant influencer who had confidently strutted into the courtroom just 2 hours prior. "I'm filing for divorce, you broke, pathetic piece of trash," she screamed, pointing a trembling finger at Bradley as the officer dragged her toward the wooden benches on the far side of the room. "I will not go to federal prison for you. I will tell the authorities everything you've done." The united front of the villains had officially shattered. The team that had marched into this building fully expecting to destroy me and steal my child was now violently tearing itself apart. Bradley's parents sat frozen in the gallery, watching their perfect golden son being physically attacked by his equally perfect new wife. His mother clutched her chest, breathing heavily, while his father stared at the floor in utter, crushing shame. They could not blame me for this disaster. They could no longer claim I was the problem. Bradley sat slumped in his chair, his expensive Italian suit rumpled, his tie askew. He breathed heavily, staring blankly at the shattered glass and spilled water on the floorboards. He looked incredibly small and defeated. For the first time in his entirely privileged life, there was no family money to bail him out. There was no clever lie to salvage his reputation. He was utterly isolated and exposed as a massive financial and moral failure before the law. I sat quietly in the witness box, observing the complete disintegration of my abuser. I felt no pity. I felt no sadness. I simply felt an overwhelming sense of profound relief. The monster who had terrorized me for a decade was finally powerless, but the trial was not yet over, as his desperate sister Caroline was about to make the gravest mistake of her life in an attempt to save him. The heavy oak doors at the back of the courtroom swung shut as the bailiffs escorted a hysterical Sienna out into the marble hallway. The echo of her screams faded, leaving a stunned, heavy silence in its wake. Judge Ramirez let out a long, exhausted sigh and pinched the bridge of her nose. She looked down at Bradley, who was still staring blankly at the shattered glass on the floor, completely broken and publicly humiliated. "I thought the hearing was effectively over. I thought the judge was about to strike her gavel and grant me full custody right then and there, so my son and I could finally go home in peace." But the toxic loyalty of his family ran far deeper than I could have ever anticipated. From the second row of the wooden gallery, Caroline suddenly stood. Her designer silk dress rustled loudly in the quiet room. She looked at her defeated brother, then turned her piercing gaze toward the judge. Her face was set in a mask of desperate determination. "Your Honor," Caroline called out, her voice shaking just enough to sound sympathetic, yet loud enough to command immediate attention. "I know I am not formally listed as a witness today, but I am begging you to let me speak. A child's life is in immediate physical danger, and you are not seeing the whole truth here today." Judge Ramirez frowned deeply, her patience clearly wearing razor thin after the explosive outbursts. Ma'am, this is a formal legal proceeding, not an open public forum, the judge sternly warned. Your family has already wasted this court's time with forged financial documents and admitted corporate fraud. I highly suggest you sit back down and remain silent. I cannot sit down, Caroline cried, taking a step toward the wooden railing. She pressed her hand over her heart, perfectly playing the role of the terrified, devoted aunt. My brother may have made terrible financial mistakes. He may be broke and desperate, but he is a good father. And the woman sitting in that witness box is an absolute monster. I have undeniable proof that she physically abused her son on Thanksgiving and coached him to create that digital recording. The words physically abused hung in the air like a poisonous cloud. In family court, those two words were the ultimate weapon. No matter how much financial fraud or perjury had already been exposed, a judge could not simply ignore a direct allegation of child abuse. Judge Ramirez stopped reaching for her gavel. She looked at Caroline, then looked over at me, and finally at my 11-year-old son. Come forward and be sworn in, the judge ordered, her tone shifting back to cautious judicial neutrality. But understand this clearly. If you are found to be lying under oath today, you will join your brother in a federal holding cell by sunset. Caroline did not flinch. She confidently walked through the swinging wooden gate, raised her right hand, and swore to tell the absolute truth. She took her seat in the witness box, sitting perfectly straight. She refused to look at me, completely focusing her theatrical performance on the judge. Tell me exactly what you witnessed, the judge demanded, leaning forward. On Thanksgiving evening, when Natalie dropped Leo off at our family home, I went outside to speak with her. Caroline began weaving her lie with chilling precision. I wanted to ask her about Leo's recent behavioral issues, but when I approached her car, I saw it happen. I saw Natalie grab Leo violently by the shoulders and shake him. She was screaming at him, telling him that if he did not record a fake audio clip framing his father, she would lock him in his bedroom for a week without food. She slapped him. Your Honor, right across the face. I felt my blood run completely cold. It takes a special kind of evil to sit in a court of law and invent a story about a mother beating her child. I looked back at the gallery and saw her husband Terrence sitting completely rigid. His hands were clenched into tight fists on his knees, his eyes burning with absolute disgust as he listened to his wife commit blatant, unforgivable perjury. But Caroline was not finished. She reached into her expensive leather handbag and pulled out a thick, sealed envelope. I did not just come here with a story, she said, her voice thick with fake emotion. I know how serious this is. That is why I immediately took action to protect my nephew. She handed the envelope to the court bailiff. Inside that envelope is a signed sworn evaluation from Dr. William Errington, a highly respected licensed child psychologist. I took Leo to see him privately the day after Thanksgiving. Dr. Errington spent 2 hours evaluating my nephew. His professional medical conclusion is right there in writing. He states unequivocally that Leo is suffering from severe physical trauma and extreme maternal manipulation. The doctor confirms that Leo confessed to him that his mother forced him to fake that audio recording. The bailiff handed the document up to the judge. Judge Ramirez broke the seal and began reading the official-looking medical letterhead. As her eyes scanned the page, the deep lines of concern returned to her face. A sworn statement from a licensed medical professional was a massive escalation. It was the kind of evidence that could instantly stall my victory and force Leo into the terrifying foster care system while a massive state investigation took place. Bradley slowly lifted his head from the table. A faint spark of hope returned to his dead eyes as he watched the judge reading the psychologist's report. He thought his sister had just saved him. He thought this fake doctor was the silver bullet that would finally destroy me. But as I looked at the signature on that medical report, a slow, cold smile crept back onto my face. Caroline had just made a fatal, catastrophic mistake. and my lawyer was already standing up, ready to completely dismantle her fake expert. My lawyer did not even wait for the judge to finish reading the forged psychological evaluation. He stepped directly out from behind our table, holding his own freshly printed stack of papers. "Your Honor," my lawyer stated, his voice ringing with absolute confidence, "I must immediately object to the admission of that document into the official court record. That evaluation is not a medical finding. It is a fabricated piece of fiction, written by a man who is not legally permitted to practice medicine in the state of New York, or anywhere else in this country." Caroline gripped the edges of the witness stand, her perfectly manicured fingernails digging into the solid wood. Her fake expression of maternal concern began to crack instantly. "I object to this slander," she snapped, glaring down at my lawyer. "Dr. Errington is a highly respected professional. He has a private practice." "He had a private practice," my lawyer corrected her, stepping much closer to the witness box. Past tense. "Your Honor," he continued, handing a thick, heavily stamped packet up to the judge's bench. "The man who signed that document, William Errington, was stripped of his medical license exactly 3 years and 2 months ago. The state medical board revoked his credentials after a lengthy federal investigation revealed he was running a massive insurance fraud scheme, billing patients for hundreds of hours of phantom therapy sessions. He is a convicted felon, currently serving a 5-year probation sentence." Judge Ramirez dropped the fake psychological evaluation onto her desk as if it had suddenly caught fire. She ripped open the packet my lawyer had just handed her and quickly scanned the medical board revocation records. Her eyes darted from the official state seal back to Caroline, who was suddenly looking incredibly small in the witness box. The judge was absolutely furious. Submitting a fake medical document in a child custody case was an unforgivable offense, but my lawyer was nowhere near finished. He turned back to Caroline, holding up a glossy printed photograph. He walked right up to the wooden railing, trapping her under his intense scrutiny. "Ms. Caroline," he said, "since you just swore under oath that you sought out this man strictly for his highly respected professional medical opinion, perhaps you can explain this photograph to the court today." He turned the photo so the judge and the gallery could clearly see it. It was a picture pulled directly from Caroline's own public social media account. It showed Caroline and the disgraced fake doctor standing together on a pristine green tennis court, holding expensive rackets and laughing over glasses of champagne. The caption beneath the photo read, "Sunday doubles with my favorite partner in crime." "You did not take my 11-year-old son to a legitimate medical clinic," my lawyer thundered, his voice echoing off the mahogany walls. "You took him to your private country club. You sat him down in the dining room with your disgraced tennis partner, and you intimidated a child into remaining silent while your fraudster friend drafted a fake psychological report on a stolen piece of obsolete medical letterhead. Is that not the absolute truth?" Caroline opened her mouth, but no sound came out. She looked wildly around the courtroom, desperate for someone to help her. She looked at Bradley, but he had already buried his face in his hands, knowing she had completely doomed them both. He could not save her. He could not even save himself. She looked at her husband Terrence in the gallery, but he only shook his head in absolute disgust, refusing to meet her pleading eyes. "Answer the question, Ms. Caroline," Judge Ramirez ordered, her voice dropping into a terrifyingly quiet register that commanded the entire room. "Did you knowingly submit a fraudulent medical document drafted by an unlicensed felon to this court today? Did you sit in that chair, place your right hand on a Bible, look me in the eye, and commit blatant perjury to manipulate a child custody hearing?" Caroline began to hyperventilate, her carefully constructed image of high society elegance completely disintegrated under the crushing weight of the law. "I just wanted to help my brother," she sobbed, her voice breaking into a pathetic, desperate whine. "Natalie is ruining our family. I had to do something to stop her." William said he still had his old clinic letterhead and nobody would ever bother to check. He said it would be easy to fool the court. The confession hung in the air, heavy and undeniable. Caroline had just admitted to a massive felony right on the public record. She had openly conspired to present fake medical evidence, and she had lied under oath to a sitting family court judge. Judge Ramirez leaned back in her high leather chair, rubbing her temples. She looked at Caroline with a mixture of profound exhaustion and deep, unyielding anger. "You people are truly unbelievable," the judge whispered, shaking her head. "You march into my courtroom acting like you own the world, and you have done absolutely nothing but lie, forge documents, and commit federal crimes since the moment you sat down. Bailiff, do not let that woman leave this building. When we adjourn today, she is to be taken directly into police custody." Caroline let out a sharp, terrified wail, covering her face with her hands as she finally realized she was going to jail. Bradley was completely paralyzed, staring blankly at the heavy wooden table in front of him. Their entire wicked plan was in absolute ruins. The fake evidence was destroyed, the perjury was exposed, and the wealthy, arrogant family was finally facing the severe legal consequences of their actions. The heavy oak doors at the back of the courtroom remained tightly closed. Caroline was sobbing into her hands, her shoulders shaking violently as the reality of her impending arrest crashed down upon her. Judge Ramirez was writing fiercely on her legal pad, preparing the official orders to have Caroline taken into police custody and to dismiss the emergency custody petition entirely. I let out a long, slow breath, feeling a massive wave of relief wash over me. The fake documents had been exposed, the perjury had been dismantled, and my son was finally safe. I thought the intense legal battle was officially over, and that justice had finally been served. But justice needed one final, undeniable voice to completely bury this family's toxic legacy forever. From the second row of the wooden gallery, a tall, imposing figure suddenly stood up. It was Terrence. He calmly unbuttoned his tailored suit jacket, his face completely expressionless. For over a decade, Terrence had sat quietly in the shadows, observing the relentless cruelty his wife and her family inflicted upon me. He was a highly intelligent African-American man who had built a lucrative career as a senior corporate consultant, relying on logic and integrity. He had always maintained a tight-lipped diplomatic distance from their dramatic chaos, simply to keep the peace in his own marriage. But today, watching them attempt to steal a child using a disgraced felon, he had reached his absolute breaking point. "Your Honor!" Terrence's deep, steady voice echoed through the massive courtroom, instantly slicing through his wife's frantic, pathetic crying. Caroline whipped her head around. When she saw her husband standing up and stepping, she knew exactly what he was about to do. "Terrence, no!" Caroline shrieked, her voice cracking into a desperate, panicked wail. "What are you doing? Sit back down right now. Please do not say anything." Terrence did not even look at her. He walked right past his wife, treating her as if she were completely invisible. His heavy leather shoes clicked sharply against the polished floorboards as he approached the swinging wooden gate that separated the public gallery from the legal floor. He stopped at the railing and looked directly up at the towering judge's bench. "My name is Terrence," he stated, clearly projecting his voice with absolute authority. "I am a senior corporate consultant, and unfortunately, I am currently married to that woman. I formally request permission to be sworn in as a direct witness to these proceedings," Terrence stated. Judge Ramirez slowly lowered her pen. She looked at Terrence, taking in his calm, professional demeanor and the sheer gravity in his eyes. It was a staggering contrast to the chaotic, lying mess of the family he had married into. "Sir, you are not listed on any of the witness disclosures provided to this court today," the judge noted cautiously. "And your wife is currently facing severe criminal charges for blatant perjury, What exactly could you possibly add to this absolute disaster of a hearing? I can add the absolute, undeniable truth, Your Honor, Terence replied, his tone unwavering and firm. I have watched my wife and her brother systematically abuse my sister-in-law for 10 years. I stayed quiet to keep the peace in my own home, which is a profound moral regret I will carry for the rest of my life. But I draw the line at watching them destroy an 11-year-old boy. I was physically present at their family estate on Thanksgiving night. I saw and heard exactly what happened. I can provide direct eyewitness testimony regarding the audio recording Leo played this morning, and I can confirm for the official record exactly who is lying in this room. Bradley suddenly snapped out of his paralyzed state. He shot up from his chair, his face pale and sweating profusely. "Objection!" he yelled, slapping the heavy oak table. "You cannot let him testify. He is completely biased. He hates our family. He is just trying to ruin me." Bradley looked frantically at his expensive lawyer, begging him to intervene. But his attorney simply crossed his arms, leaned back in his chair, and looked up at the ceiling, completely refusing to engage. The lawyer knew it was entirely over and was not going to risk his own law license to save a sinking ship. "Mr. Bradley, your lawyer is smart enough to know when to stop talking," Judge Ramirez snapped, glaring heavily at my ex-husband. "You would be extremely wise to follow his example and sit down before I hold you in contempt." The judge turned her sharp attention back to Terence. "Given the unprecedented level of fraud, forgery, and perjury your family has already introduced into my courtroom today, I am going to allow this," she ruled firmly. "Bailiff, please swear the gentleman in." Terence pushed open the swinging wooden gate and walked toward the witness box. As he passed Caroline, she reached out and desperately grabbed his arm, sobbing uncontrollably. "Please do not do this to us," she begged, her expensive makeup running in dark streaks down her face. "You are going to ruin everything." Terence stopped. He looked down at his wife's desperate, gripping hand. Then he looked her dead in the eye with a gaze so cold it could freeze water. "You ruined everything the moment you brought a fake medical report to a judge to steal a child," he said, his voice completely devoid of any affection or sympathy. He pulled his arm out of her grasp, walked up to the witness stand, and placed his right hand on the Bible, ready to deliver the final crushing blow. The court bailiff held out the worn leather Bible. Terence placed his large hand firmly upon it, swearing to tell the whole truth and nothing but the truth. He sat down in the wooden witness chair, adjusting his tailored suit jacket, and folded his hands neatly in his lap. He did not look nervous or intimidated. He looked entirely in his element, commanding the space with a quiet, undeniable power. Judge Ramirez leaned forward, resting her chin on her folded hands. "State your full name and occupation for the record, please," the judge requested, her tone noticeably more respectful than it had been with anyone else from his wife's family. "My name is Terence," he replied, his deep voice carrying effortlessly across the silent room. "I am a senior partner at a global corporate consulting firm specializing in high-level mergers and acquisitions. I spend my entire life analyzing complex contracts, verifying corporate facts, and identifying massive financial fraud. I have absolutely nothing to gain by sitting in this chair today. In fact, by testifying against my own wife and my brother-in-law, I am intentionally detonating my own marriage. I will likely be walking out of this building straight into a divorce lawyer's office. But I refuse to sit quietly in the gallery and watch an innocent child be destroyed by a coordinated, cowardly campaign of lies." Judge Ramirez nodded slowly, giving him her full, undivided attention. "Please address the testimony your wife just provided regarding the events of Thanksgiving evening," the judge instructed, her pen hovering over her legal pad. Terence did not even bother to look at Caroline, who was still weeping quietly at the defense table. "My wife committed blatant perjury," he stated plainly, without a single ounce of hesitation or regret. I was standing in the grand foyer of the estate the entire time Natalie was dropping off her son. The front door was wide open, and the porch light was on. I had a completely clear, unobstructed view of the driveway. Natalie never raised her voice. She never made a single threatening gesture, and she absolutely never laid a hand on her child. She stood there absorbing a barrage of vile, classist insults from my wife with more dignity and grace than I have ever seen from anyone in that toxic family. Natalie simply handed over the boy and drove away into the night. The entire narrative my wife just invented about physical abuse and coercion was a complete and absolute fabrication designed solely to manipulate this court. The judge pressed her lips together into a thin, hard line. She wrote a quick, sharp note on her legal pad, her expression hardening into solid stone. "And what happened after the mother left the premises?" the judge asked, looking back up. Terrence shifted his gaze directly to Bradley. Bradley shrank back into his expensive leather chair, physically recoiling as if he were trying to disappear completely. He could not meet Terrence's intense, burning stare. "That is when the real abuse occurred," Terrence testified, his voice dropping into a register of profound, utter disgust. Bradley did not welcome his son with open arms. He marched down the grand staircase, grabbed the boy aggressively by the upper arm, and physically dragged him down the hallway into his private mahogany study. He slammed the door shut and locked it from the inside. But the walls of that old historic house are not as soundproof as he arrogantly assumes they are. I followed them down the hallway because I did not like the violent, unhinged look in Bradley's eyes. I stood directly outside that heavy oak door, perfectly still. Terrence paused, making sure every single person in the room was hanging on his next word. "I heard every single threat Bradley made," Terrence continued. "I heard the boy crying softly. I heard Bradley slam his fist onto his wooden desk to intimidate the child. I heard him tell his 11-year-old son that he would permanently cut off his health insurance. I heard him explicitly threaten to have the bank evict his mother from her apartment. I heard him order the boy to stand in front of a judge and lie under oath, or else they would both starve on the streets." The audio recording that brave child played for this court earlier this morning is 100% authentic. It is not an artificial intelligence deepfake. It is the raw, terrifying reality of a dangerous, abusive father terrorizing his own flesh and blood to serve his own fragile ego. Terrence did not move to stand up. Instead, he reached into the breast pocket of his tailored suit jacket. "Your Honor," he said, his voice cutting through the tense silence once again. "I am not completely finished. Custody and abuse are only half the reason this man dragged my sister-in-law into this courtroom today. The other half is purely financial, and I have the evidence to prove it." Terrence pulled his hand from his pocket and held up a small, heavy silver flash drive. The overhead fluorescent lights caught the metallic surface, making it gleam. Bradley's eyes locked onto that tiny device, and all the remaining blood instantly drained from his face. He let out a strange, choked sound, a pathetic whimper of absolute defeat. "Exactly 1 month ago," Terrence continued, looking directly at the judge, "Bradley came to my corporate office unannounced. He was sweating, shaking, and completely desperate. He told me that his tech startup was facing a routine financial audit from his angel investors, and he needed a massive favor. Because I am married to his sister, he arrogantly assumed that family loyalty meant I would gladly compromise my own professional integrity to save his skin. He demanded that I look at his corporate ledgers and clean them up before the investors could see the massive holes in his accounting." Terrence lowered his hand and placed the silver flash drive onto the wooden railing of the witness stand. "I agreed to conduct the audit," Terrence said, his tone turning incredibly sharp. "But I did not clean up his mess. I dug straight to the bottom of it. Because when I look at financial records, I do not just see numbers. I see exactly where the money goes. And what I found hidden beneath layers of fake vendor invoices and shell corporations was staggering. The court bailiff stepped forward, picking up the silver flash drive and carrying it up to the towering wooden desk. Judge Ramirez took the device, holding it carefully between her fingers as if it were a loaded weapon. That drive contains the complete, unedited financial architecture of Bradley's fraud, Terrence testified, projecting his voice so the court reporter would not miss a single syllable. But the most damning files on that drive have absolutely nothing to do with his failing tech startup. They have to do with his divorce from Natalie 3 years ago. During the dissolution of their marriage, Bradley swore under oath to this very court that he possessed no liquid assets and could therefore only afford to pay the absolute bare minimum in child support. Terrence turned his head slowly, locking his dark, furious eyes onto his brother-in-law. "That was a massive, documented lie," Terrence stated. "The drive you are holding, Your Honor, contains irrefutable proof that in the 6 months leading up to his divorce, Bradley systematically liquidated hundreds of thousands of dollars in shared marital assets. He intentionally funneled that money into 3 separate offshore accounts located in the Cayman Islands. He starved his own child and financially abused his ex-wife while sitting on a hidden fortune." Bradley shot up from his chair, knocking it backward onto the floorboards with a loud crash. "You stole my private property," he screamed, pointing a violently shaking finger at Terrence. "That was a confidential consultation. You signed a non-disclosure agreement. You cannot use that against me in a court of law." Terrence's expression did not change. He did not even blink at the outburst. "I am a licensed corporate officer and an officer of the court," Terrence replied, his voice drowning out Bradley's pathetic screaming. "The moment I discovered you were actively committing federal tax evasion, wire fraud, and perjury, my non-disclosure agreement became entirely null and void under the law. I do not aid and abet criminals, especially not abusive cowards who threaten children." "Sit down right now, Mr. Bradley," Judge Ramirez roared, grabbing her gavel and slamming it down with terrifying force. The bailiff immediately rushed forward, grabbing Bradley by the shoulders and forcefully shoving him back down into his seat. Bradley's highly paid attorney, who had been completely silent during this entire exchange, simply stood up, picked up his heavy leather chair, and physically moved it 3 feet away from his client. He wanted to make it abundantly clear to the judge that he was entirely separating himself from the walking felony sitting next to him. Judge Ramirez placed the silver flash drive gently onto her desk, right next to the forged financial documents Bradley had submitted earlier that morning. She looked at Terrence and gave him a slow, solemn nod of gratitude. "You have done a tremendous service to this court today, sir," she said quietly. I sat in my own chair, watching the man who had tormented me for years finally face the absolute destruction of his entire life. The financial trap he had built to destroy me had completely reversed and swallowed him whole. But as Terrence remained on the stand, the information on that drive was about to claim one more unexpected victim. "Your Honor," Terrence said, his voice breaking the brief moment of silence that had settled over the room following Bradley's outburst. "There is one specific folder on that drive I strongly advise you to open immediately. It is labeled with the exact name of the luxury lifestyle brand the plaintiff's current wife was bragging about just a short while ago." Judge Ramirez plugged the silver flash drive into her secure judicial terminal on the bench. Her eyes scanned the screen as she navigated through the digital files Terrence had meticulously organized. "As I audited the tech startup's financial ledgers," Terrence explained, maintaining his calm, clinical tone, "I noticed a massive discrepancy in their operating expenses. Bradley was taking hundreds of thousands of dollars in initial seed money, money explicitly provided by his angel investors for software development, and routing it through a complex web of dummy marketing contracts. Those contracts were entirely fake. They were designed specifically to funnel the stolen corporate capital directly into a single limited liability company." Terrence pointed toward the heavy oak doors at the back of the courtroom, where Sienna had been escorted out earlier. That limited liability company is registered entirely in Sienna's name, Terrence stated. Bradley used her influencer brand as a completely unregulated shell corporation. He laundered the stolen investor money by classifying the illegal transfers as brand sponsorships and private business grants. And because Sienna is the sole proprietor of that company, she is the one who legally signed the banking agreements. She is the one whose name is on the fraudulent tax returns. Judge Ramirez stopped scrolling. The glowing light from her computer monitor illuminated the absolute severity on her face. She looked up and locked eyes with the bailiff standing near the back of the room. "Officer!" the judge commanded sharply, "go out into the hallway and bring that woman back inside my courtroom immediately." The bailiff nodded, opening the heavy wooden doors and disappearing into the marble corridor. A few moments later, he returned, practically dragging Sienna back into the room. She looked absolutely miserable. Her expensive white designer dress was still stained with water. Her makeup was completely ruined, and she was clutching her expensive handbag like a life preserver. She walked back to the plaintiff table, keeping a wide distance from Bradley, who was still staring blankly at the floor. Sienna assumed she was being brought back inside to finalize the destruction of her marriage. She had no idea she was walking right into a federal trap. "Step forward and listen very carefully to what I'm about to tell you," Judge Ramirez ordered, pointing a pen directly at Sienna. "Your husband did not just lie to you about being wealthy. He actively used you to commit massive corporate crimes." Sienna froze. Her red-rimmed eyes darted wildly between the judge and Terrence. "What are you talking about?" she stammered, her voice trembling. "I did not do anything. I just run a lifestyle blog." "You run a money laundering operation," the judge corrected her in a cold, unyielding tone. "This court has just been provided with undeniable digital proof that your personal business was used to wash hundreds of thousands of dollars in stolen investor capital. Your signature is on the incorporation documents. Your name is on the fraudulent bank accounts. Earlier that day, when you stood before this court and proudly admitted to receiving enormous financial transfers that paid for luxury trips across Europe and funded your collection of designer handbags, you effectively confessed to accepting stolen assets." Sienna's mouth fell open. The color vanished from her face so quickly it seemed as though she might collapse at any moment. "I didn't know," she whispered, stumbling backward in panic. "He just gave me documents and told me where to sign. He said it was tax paperwork. I don't understand corporate finances. I swear I had no idea the money came from anything illegal." "Deliberate ignorance is not a recognized defense against federal financial crimes," Judge Ramirez replied sharply. "You spent the money willingly. You enjoyed every benefit that came with it. You flaunted a lifestyle funded by stolen wealth. While sitting in this courtroom, you actively assisted a man attempting to take a child away from a hardworking mother. You are not a victim here. You are a documented participant." The word participant struck Sienna like a physical blow. The fantasy she had built around her glamorous existence shattered instantly. She wasn't going to simply walk away from Bradley and find another wealthy benefactor. She was facing investigations, criminal scrutiny, and the possibility of years behind bars. A broken gasp escaped her lips as her legs gave out. She sank heavily into the chair beside the plaintiff's table. Her hands clutched at her chest while she struggled to breathe. Short, frantic breaths echoed through the silent courtroom. Her designer purse slipped from her grasp, crashing onto the floor and scattering expensive cosmetics in every direction. She buried her fingers in her hair and rocked back and forth in terror. Bradley never even looked at her. He remained frozen, consumed by the reality of his own downfall. The wealthy, arrogant couple that had worked so hard to destroy my family had become nothing more than two frightened criminals waiting for the consequences to arrive. The courtroom remained silent except for Sienna's trembling breaths. Bradley sat motionless for several agonizing moments. His eyes remained fixed on the polished floor as though he could somehow disappear from reality. Everything he had spent years building was gone. The successful entrepreneur persona he had carefully crafted had finally collapsed. He was no visionary businessman. He was an exposed fraud staring directly at the possibility of a lengthy prison sentence. Then something inside him finally broke. The change was immediate. The polished, charming image he had maintained for years vanished completely. Hatred twisted across his face. His skin flushed dark red, and the veins along his neck stood out beneath his expensive collar. Slowly, he turned away from his devastated wife and fixed his bloodshot eyes on Terence. Terence sat calmly in the witness stand, observing everything with unwavering composure. That calm dignity pushed Bradley beyond his limit. "You ruined everything!" Bradley bellowed. His voice exploded through the courtroom with raw fury. Before anyone could react, he violently shoved his chair backward. The heavy chair slammed against the floor. Ignoring the judge, the attorneys, and the officers present, Bradley lunged forward. He charged directly across the courtroom toward the witness stand. He wasn't simply angry. He had completely lost control. As he rushed forward, he unleashed a stream of venomous insults. His shouting echoed against the high wooden walls. The outburst revealed prejudices that had remained hidden for years behind carefully maintained appearances. He screamed threats at Terence. He promised revenge. He ranted that someone like Terence had no right to challenge a family like his. Terence never flinched. He didn't retreat. He didn't raise a hand. He simply stood from the witness chair, towering above the railing, and stared down at Bradley with absolute contempt. Terence knew Bradley preyed only on those he perceived as weaker than himself. He wasn't intimidated for a second. But Bradley never reached him. The court bailiffs were already moving. The older officer intercepted him just before he reached the gate. Grabbing the back of Bradley's expensive suit jacket, he yanked him off balance. At the same moment, a second bailiff charged in from the side. The heavily built officer wrapped both arms around Bradley's waist and drove him to the floor. The collision thundered through the room. Bradley slammed into the hardwood floor with brutal force. The impact knocked the air from his lungs and silenced his screaming instantly. Both officers pinned him down, their weight pressed heavily against his shoulders and back. "Put your hands behind your back now," one bailiff ordered. "Stop resisting, or additional force will be used." Bradley fought wildly. He kicked, twisted, and struggled against their grip. Fear and rage had stripped away every ounce of self-control. But he was no match for trained officers. Within seconds, they secured both arms behind his back. The sharp metallic snap of handcuffs echoed across the courtroom. It was the most satisfying sound I had ever heard. Judge Ramirez had risen from her chair the instant Bradley charged. Standing behind the bench, she watched the chaos unfold with visible disgust. During decades on the bench, she had witnessed countless family disputes. But this combination of violent behavior, prejudice, and financial misconduct was unlike anything she had encountered. Sienna sat crying uncontrollably. Curled into her chair, she covered her face with both hands, horrified by the man she had married. My attorney instinctively stepped in front of me and my son. I gently moved him aside. I wanted to witness this moment. I wanted Leo to witness it too. I wanted my brave 11-year-old son to watch the man who had terrorized him for years finally face consequences. Eventually, Bradley stopped struggling. His cheek rested against the cold floor. His expensive suit was torn and covered in dust. He lay there, breathing heavily, utterly humiliated before the judge, attorneys, and everyone else in the room. The wealthy predator had finally been reduced to what he truly was, a desperate criminal with nowhere left to run. The bailiffs eventually pulled Bradley to his feet. His suit jacket hung torn at the shoulder and his silk tie was crooked around his neck. They forced him back into his chair at the plaintiff's table. His wrists remained secured behind his back. One officer stood directly behind him with a firm hand on his shoulder. The sound of Bradley's ragged breathing filled the silent courtroom. He was no longer a respected tech founder. He was no longer an untouchable bully. He was simply a defeated man watching his entire world collapse around him. He was just a pathetic, broken man waiting for his final, inevitable judgment. Order had been violently restored, but the heavy tension in the room was still suffocating. Judge Ramirez stood tall behind her massive wooden bench. She did not sit down. She looked out over the courtroom, her piercing brown eyes scanning the absolute wreckage of the family that had dared to insult the integrity of her court. When she finally spoke, her voice did not echo with loud, frantic anger. It was dangerously quiet, carrying a lethal, chilling authority that demanded absolute, unblinking obedience from every single person in the room. "Mr. Bradley," Judge Ramirez began her words, slicing through the dead air like a sharpened blade. "I have sat on this bench for nearly 30 years. I have presided over thousands of complex family disputes. I have seen bitter divorces, angry spouses, and tragic misunderstandings. But I have never in my entire judicial career witnessed such a profound, deeply coordinated display of pure, malicious evil." She picked up the forged financial documents he had submitted earlier that morning. She held them up for a brief second before dropping them into a nearby metal wastebasket with a loud, dismissive thud. "You walked into my courtroom today, believing you were completely untouchable." The judge continued, her gaze locked onto his terrified, sweating face. "You believed that because you come from generational wealth, you could simply buy your way to custody and crush anyone who stood in your way. You forged federal banking documents to frame an innocent woman. You committed blatant perjury right in front of my face. You colluded with your sister to produce a fraudulent medical report from a convicted felon. You laundered stolen corporate funds through your new wife's vanity business to fund your lavish vacations. And worst of all, you psychologically tortured your own 11-year-old son, threatening to starve him simply to feed your massive, fragile ego." Bradley kept his eyes glued to the scuffed floorboards, entirely unable to look the judge in the face. His parents, sitting in the gallery behind him, were completely silent. Their heads bowed in absolute crushing shame. The family name they prized above all else was now permanently stained with multiple federal felonies. Judge Ramirez then turned her attention away from the plaintiff table and looked directly at me. The harsh, severe lines on her face softened into an expression of profound, undeniable respect. "Ms. Natalie," the judge said, her voice warming slightly but still projecting with immense authority, "for 3 years, you have endured a ruthless campaign of financial abuse and emotional terrorism that would have completely broken most people. Your ex-husband and his family mocked you at every turn. They called you worthless. They tried to strip away your dignity, your career, and your child. But you did not scream. You did not retaliate with illegal tactics or stoop to their vile level. You simply put your head down, built a $40 million commercial real estate empire in complete silence, and allowed their own arrogant stupidity to completely destroy them. That requires a level of intelligence, grace, and silent strength that this man could never even begin to comprehend." I nodded slowly, feeling a heavy, suffocating knot in my chest finally begin to untangle. I squeezed Leo's hand gently, feeling his small fingers grip mine back. Then Judge Ramirez looked down at my son. She offered him a kind, deeply reassuring smile that completely contrasted with the fierce wrath she had just unleashed on his father. "Leo," the judge said, leaning forward, resting her hands on the polished wood. "It is incredibly terrifying to stand up to a bully. It is even more terrifying when that bully happens to be your own father. When he locked you in that dark study on Thanksgiving night, he thought he had you completely trapped. He thought you were just a scared little boy who would blindly do whatever he commanded. But you were smarter than him. You were much braver than him. By pressing that record button on your phone, you did not just protect your mother, you protected yourself. You showed more integrity, courage, and character in one single night than your entire paternal family has shown in their entire lives. You never have to be afraid of that man ever again." Leo sat up a little straighter in his wooden chair. A small, proud smile touched his lips, and I saw the immense relief washing over him. For the first time in his young life, the heavy, toxic shadow his father had cast over him was entirely gone. Judge Ramirez stood completely straight again, her black judicial robe falling perfectly into place. She picked up her heavy wooden gavel. The time for testimony and dramatic revelations was officially over. The brutal public dismantling of Bradley's lies was entirely complete. It was time for the final legal hammer to fall and permanently sever this highly toxic family from our lives forever. Judge Ramirez picked up her heavy silver pen and pulled a fresh stack of official court orders toward the center of her desk. The entire room held its collective breath. Even the court reporters seemed to type quieter, completely mesmerized by the absolute finality radiating from the bench. Based on the overwhelming, irrefutable evidence presented in this courtroom today, Judge Ramirez announced, her voice projecting with absolute legal certainty, "I am issuing an immediate and permanent ruling on this emergency petition. Mr. Bradley, your request for physical and legal custody of the minor child is denied in its entirety. Furthermore, due to the severe documented psychological abuse you inflicted upon your son and the massive fraudulent schemes you orchestrated, I am stripping you of all parental rights effective this exact second. You will have 0 physical custody. You will have 0 legal custody. You will have absolutely no visitation rights of any kind, supervised or otherwise." Bradley squeezed his eyes shut, his handcuffed arms pulling awkwardly against his shoulders. He did not argue. He had absolutely nothing left to fight with. "I am granting full, sole, legal, and physical custody to the mother, Natalie." The judge continued signing the first document with a swift, heavy stroke of her pen. "She has demonstrated exceptional stability, profound emotional maturity, and absolute financial independence. She is the only parent in this room fit to raise a child." I let out a shaky breath, squeezing Leo's hand. We had won. The dark cloud that had hovered over us for a decade was finally lifting. I looked down at my son and saw tears of pure relief welling up in his bright, intelligent eyes. He leaned his head against my arm, knowing he was finally truly safe. But Judge Ramirez was far from finished. "In addition to the custody ruling," the judge stated, picking up a second thick legal document, "I am hereby granting a 5-year permanent restraining order to protect Natalie and her son. This order legally prohibits you, Mr. Bradley, from coming within 1,000 feet of your ex-wife, your son, her residence, her place of business, and the child's school." And because the toxic behavior in this case was a deeply coordinated family effort, this restraining order extends fully to your current wife, Sienna, and your sister, Caroline. A sharp gasp echoed from the hallway doors where Caroline was being detained, but the judge completely ignored it. "If any of you attempt to contact Natalie or her son by phone, by email, through third parties, or in person, you will be immediately arrested and jailed without bail," the judge warned, her eyes sweeping across the broken family. "You are to permanently erase their existence from your lives. Do you understand me?" Bradley gave a weak, pathetic nod, his chin touching his chest. Finally, the judge turned her attention to the court clerk sitting quietly to her left. She picked up the small silver flash drive Terrence had provided, along with the forged bank records and the fake medical evaluation. She placed them all into a heavy manila envelope and sealed it firmly. "Madam Clerk," Judge Ramirez instructed, handing the sealed package down, "I want you to officially stamp these items into evidence. The moment we adjourn today, you are to draft an urgent judicial referral. You will immediately forward the contents of this envelope directly to the Regional Field Office of the Federal Bureau of Investigation and the Criminal Investigation Division of the Internal Revenue Service. Bradley's highly paid attorney visibly winced. Sending a judicial referral directly from a sitting family court judge meant the federal agencies would not just review the case. They would immediately prioritize it. You will inform the federal authorities that this court has received direct testimony and digital evidence confirming massive offshore tax evasion, corporate wire fraud, and the intentional laundering of stolen investor capital. The judge commanded. You will also include the official court transcript of Sienna's full verbal confession to receiving those stolen funds. Sienna let out another ragged sob, burying her face against the heavy wooden table. She was officially the primary target of a federal criminal probe. And finally, the judge said, looking directly at the bailiff holding Bradley's shoulder, you will contact the local district attorney's office, inform them that I am formally recommending immediate felony perjury charges against Caroline and forgery charges against Mr. Bradley. I want arrest warrants drafted before the sun goes down today. Judge Ramirez stacked her papers neatly, bringing perfect order to the absolute chaos she had just untangled. She looked down at Bradley one last time. You came into my courtroom trying to use the law as a weapon to destroy an innocent mother, the judge said, her voice dropping to a harsh, chilling whisper. But the law does not belong to you. You are dismissed from my court, but you are not dismissed from the consequences of your actions. May the federal authorities show you exactly as much mercy as you showed your own son. Judge Ramirez raised her heavy wooden gavel and brought it down on the sounding block. The sharp, loud crack echoed through the courtroom like a gunshot, signaling the absolute end of Bradley's reign of terror. This hearing is officially adjourned. The heavy wooden doors of the courtroom swung open, and the chaotic energy that had been contained inside finally spilled out into the sprawling marble hallway of the courthouse. I remained seated at the defense table for just a moment longer, holding my son's hand, simply letting the profound reality of our absolute victory wash over me. My lawyer began packing his briefcase with a satisfied smile. But outside in the corridor, the nightmare for my ex-husband's family was just reaching its absolute crescendo. Sienna had been allowed to leave the courtroom first, but she did not run for the exit. She was pacing furiously back and forth near the elevators, her heels clicking sharply against the polished stone floor. When the two massive bailiffs finally pushed through the double doors, physically escorting a handcuffed Bradley out into the public hallway, Sienna stopped dead in her tracks. Her eyes locked onto the broken man she had married, and any remaining shred of the delicate, loving wife persona completely evaporated. Bradley looked up at her, his face pale and covered in a sheen of cold sweat. "Sienna, please," he begged, his voice cracking pathetically as the officers paused to wait for the elevator. "We can hire a criminal defense attorney. We can figure a way out of this. You just need to stick to the story and tell the feds you knew nothing about the corporate accounts." Sienna let out a laugh so harsh and completely devoid of sanity that it echoed down the entire length of the corridor. "Stick to the story?" she shrieked, taking a step toward him. Her face was flushed dark red with pure, unadulterated rage. "You want me to go down with your sinking ship while you sit in a federal prison cell? You lied to me about your wealth. You used my name to launder stolen money. You just lost your own child, and you legally destroyed your entire family in less than 3 hours. I am not sticking to anything." Sienna reached down and violently grabbed her left hand. She gripped the massive 2-carat diamond engagement ring Bradley had bought her using stolen investor funds and yanked it off her finger. With a scream of absolute disgust, she threw the heavy piece of jewelry directly at Bradley's chest. The ring hit his torn suit jacket and bounced off, clattering loudly against the hard marble floor and rolling away into a corner. "I am filing for an immediate annulment," Sienna yelled, pointing a shaking, manicured finger right in his face. I am calling my own lawyer right now and I am taking a plea deal. I will tell the Federal Bureau of Investigation absolutely everything they want to know. I will give them your passwords, your hidden bank account numbers, and every single fake vendor contract you ever made me sign. I will personally hand them the keys to your prison cell if it keeps me from doing time for your pathetic financial crimes. Bradley physically recoiled as if she had slapped him. The ultimate betrayal from the woman he had chosen over me completely broke whatever tiny fraction of his spirit remained. "You greedy, ungrateful brat," he hissed, struggling against the heavy steel handcuffs. "I gave you that lifestyle. You were a nobody before you met me." "That is enough," the larger bailiff barked, shoving Bradley forward as the elevator doors finally slid open with a soft chime. "You can save the domestic disputes for the county jail. Move inside right now." The courthouse police officers who had been summoned to assist with the transport stepped forward, completely surrounding Bradley. They grabbed him roughly by the shoulders and forced him into the crowded elevator. Bradley did not fight them this time. All the violent rage that had possessed him inside the courtroom was completely gone, replaced by the crushing, terrifying realization that his life as a free, wealthy man was officially over. He looked out through the closing elevator doors, his eyes searching desperately for anyone to save him. He looked at his parents who were standing frozen near the courtroom entrance, completely unwilling to step forward and intervene. And then his eyes met mine as I walked out into the hallway with Leo. I did not gloat. I did not offer him a smug smile or a final parting insult. I simply looked at him with the cold, distant indifference he truly deserved. The stainless steel doors slid shut, cutting off his panicked face and taking him down to the basement holding cells to be processed for his violent courtroom assault and multiple federal felony charges. Sienna did not even watch him go. She immediately pulled out her smartphone, her hands shaking violently as she frantically dialed a number to hire a criminal defense attorney. She turned her back on her former in-laws and practically sprinted down the hallway toward the exit, leaving her fake diamond ring sitting completely forgotten in the dust on the courthouse floor. The villains were violently turning on each other, completely consumed by the massive legal inferno they had started themselves. As Sienna disappeared down the long corridor, the heavy silence of the courthouse hallway returned, but the destruction was not entirely finished. I stood near the heavy wooden doors, holding Leo's hand, preparing to finally walk out of this building and into our new life. Before we could even take a step toward the exit, a pathetic, desperate sobbing echoed from the other side of the hallway. It was Caroline. She was being escorted out of the courtroom by a female court officer who was gripping her upper arm firmly. The judge had ordered her arrest for felony perjury, and the reality of a jail cell was completely destroying her facade. Caroline dragged her feet, her expensive designer heels scuffing against the polished marble floor. Her face was an absolute disaster of ruined makeup and uncontrollable tears. When she looked up and saw Terrence standing near the large floor-to-ceiling windows, her entire body heaved with a violent, desperate sob. She yanked her arm, trying to pull away from the officer. "Please, let me talk to my husband," she begged, her voice cracking into a high-pitched, pathetic whine. "Just give me 1 minute, please. I need to speak to my husband." The court officer glanced at Terrence. Terrence gave a short, slow nod, indicating he was willing to entertain this final conversation. The officer released Caroline's arm, but took a firm step closer, making it abundantly clear that Caroline was not going anywhere except the county jail. Caroline practically threw herself at Terrence. She reached out with both hands, grabbing the lapels of his tailored suit jacket, burying her tear-stained face against his chest. "Terrence, please, you have to fix this," Caroline wept, staining his expensive suit with her tears. "You know all the best defense attorneys. You have to call them right now. You have to bail me out. I cannot go to jail, Terrence. I cannot survive in a place like that. You know I only did it for my brother. I only lied for family. You have to understand that. We are family. Terrence did not wrap his arms around her. He did not offer a single word of comfort or try to wipe the tears from her face. He stood completely rigid, his hands resting casually at his sides, allowing her to desperately cling to him. When she finally looked up at him, hoping to find a shred of the love and protection he had provided for the last 10 years, she found absolutely nothing. His dark eyes were entirely devoid of warmth. "You did not lie for family, Caroline," Terrence said, his voice completely flat and terrifyingly calm. "You lied because you are a cruel, arrogant woman who believes the rules do not apply to you. You sat in that witness box and tried to destroy a completely innocent mother and her child. You proudly handed a forged medical document to a sitting judge. You showed the entire world exactly who you are, and I am thoroughly disgusted that I ever allowed myself to be associated with you." Caroline gasped, taking a stumbling step backward. Her hands fell away from his jacket. "But I am your wife," she stammered, shaking her head in absolute disbelief. "You took vows. You promised to stand by me." Terrence slowly reached down and unlatched his heavy leather briefcase. He opened the polished brass clasps and reached inside. "I promised to stand by a partner," Terrence corrected her, maintaining his icy, authoritative tone. "I never promised to anchor my life to a convicted felon, and I absolutely never promised to remain tethered to a family of vile, unrepentant bigots. I have sat quietly at your parents' dinner table for 10 years, listening to the subtle racist remarks, the classist jokes, and the endless toxic superiority you all share. I stayed because I mistakenly believed you were different from them. Today, you proved you are exactly like them." Terrence pulled a thick manila envelope from his briefcase. He held it out, extending his arm until the envelope was pressed directly against Caroline's chest. She instinctively raised her shaking hands to take it. "What is this?" Caroline whispered, her eyes wide with terror, staring down at the heavy envelope. "Those are divorce papers," Terrence stated, his voice echoing clearly against the marble walls, ensuring everyone in the hallway heard him. "I had my legal team draft them the moment I found out about the fake psychological evaluation. I have already signed them. My attorneys will be contacting the jail to arrange for your signature. Do not ever call my phone again. Do not ask my firm for financial assistance. You are entirely on your own." Caroline's legs completely gave out. She collapsed onto her knees right there on the hard courthouse floor, clutching the manila envelope to her chest as she let out a harrowing, agonizing scream. It was the sound of a woman who had just lost absolutely everything: her freedom, her marriage, her wealth, and her completely unearned social status. Terrence did not look down at her. He snapped his briefcase shut, turned his back on the crying woman, and walked away. He passed me and Leo, offering us a polite, respectful nod, before continuing down the corridor and pushing through the heavy glass exit doors. The female court officer reached down, grabbing Caroline by the shoulders and pulling her roughly back onto her feet. "It is time to go," the officer stated firmly, dragging the hysterical, weeping woman toward the holding elevators. The absolute destruction of Bradley's family was now completely irreversible. The heavy glass exit doors were just a few dozen yards away at the end of the long marble corridor. After watching Terrence deliver the final devastating blow to Caroline, my son and I turned our backs on the chaos and walked toward the main elevator bank. The air in the courthouse hallway finally felt light and breathable. I looked down at Leo, who was holding my hand tightly. His small shoulders finally relaxed after years of carrying the heavy burden of his father's expectations. We were seconds away from stepping into the elevator and leaving this horrific chapter of our lives behind us forever. But as I reached out to press the glowing call button, two figures stepped out from the alcove near the restrooms, completely blocking our path. It was Bradley's parents. Just 3 days ago, on Thanksgiving evening, These were the same two people who had stood in their grand foyer, swirling expensive wine in their crystal glasses, while their daughter handed me a fake custody petition. They had laughed at my expense. They had spent a decade treating me like a stray dog that had wandered onto their pristine, manicured lawn. Earlier this very morning, they had sat in the courtroom gallery, dripping in designer clothing, acting like untouchable royalty, while they waited for the judge to legally steal my child. Now, however, the arrogant royal facade was entirely gone. They looked incredibly small, fragile, and suddenly very old. Bradley's mother took a hesitant step forward, wringing her hands together nervously. Her expensive silk blouse was wrinkled, and her perfectly styled hair had fallen flat against her face. She forced a sickeningly sweet, wavering smile onto her lips, a smile that looked completely unnatural on a woman who had only ever scowled at me. "Natalie, sweetheart," Bradley's mother began, her voice dripping with a fake, syrupy affection that made my stomach turn. "Please, just wait a moment, dear. We need to talk to you. Just family to family." I kept my hand steady on the elevator button, not retracting it. My head simply turned and I met her gaze, utterly unfazed by the theatrical display. "We are simply astounded by the events that transpired," Bradley's father interjected, aligning himself with his wife and offering a pitiable, subservient bow. "We were completely unaware of Bradley's involvement in those disreputable financial dealings. And Caroline, certainly, we cannot fathom her thought process with that deplorable, fabricated medical report. They made their own unfortunate decisions, Natalie. However, you must understand that we have always recognized you as a resilient and capable mother." Their blatant falsehood was nearly comical. They were actively sacrificing their own children for their benefit, seeking to preserve their reputation and their connection to my recently disclosed fortune. Bradley's mother edged a bit closer, extending her hand as if to grasp my arm. "Please, Natalie," she implored, her eyes welling with tears I knew were entirely feigned for my consideration. "Bradley and Caroline are facing the repercussions of their actions, but Leo is our sole grandson. He is of our blood. We cannot bear to lose him as well. Thanksgiving is far from over. Allow us to spend the weekend with him, as we had arranged. Let us indulge him and demonstrate the depth of his grandparents' affection. We can consign these convoluted legal entanglements to the past and simply be a family." Leo instinctively recoiled, seeking refuge behind my leg. He had no desire to accompany them. He was acutely aware of their toxicity. I slowly removed my hand from the wall and depressed the illuminated down button for the elevator. A delicate chime resonated in the corridor, announcing the elevator's approach. I redirected my complete attention to the two desperate hypocrites before me. My voice remained steady, devoid of animosity. I did not critique their attire or berate them for the decade of psychological torment they had inflicted. A mere smile graced my lips. It was a smile of deadly calmness, a terrifying expression that erased the manufactured hope from their faces. "It appears you are laboring under a profound misapprehension of the proceedings in that courtroom," I stated, my voice as smooth and frigid as ice. "The judge not only revoked your son's parental rights, but also issued a 5-year permanent restraining order to shield us from the systematic abuse perpetrated by your entire family. By legal definition, this established boundary unequivocally encompasses both of you." Bradley's mother let out a sharp intake of breath, her hand flying to her chest in a gesture of feigned shock. "But we are his grandparents," she stammered, her voice laced with desperation. "You cannot legally prevent us from seeing him." "I can, and I most certainly will," I retorted, advancing slightly, forcing them to retreat against the polished marble wall. "You are not his family. You are the individuals who stood by and watched him being forcibly confined to a study for torment. Yet you did not intervene to halt it, as your esteemed country club reputation was paramount to his well-being. You possess absolutely no claim to my son." The elevator doors parted behind me with a soft mechanical sigh. I ushered Leo inside, my gaze fixed intently on Bradley's parents. "Should either of you make any attempt to contact me," I warned, backing into the elevator car, "if you ever endeavor to call his phone, dispatch a letter to my residence, or approach within 500 feet of my son, I will not only contact the authorities for your arrest on charges of violating a federal court order. I will leverage a fraction of my corporate assets to entirely purchase the mortgages within your exclusive gated community. I will personally acquire your cherished elite country club and have it razed to construct a low-income commercial strip mall. I will ensure you forfeit every vestige of the social standing you so ardently venerate. Do not presume to test me." Bradley's mother emitted a faint, terrified whimper, clinging to her husband's arm as he gazed at me, paralyzed by sheer terror. They recognized the financial capacity I possessed to fulfill my pronouncements. They understood this was not an idle threat. "Have a most splendid Thanksgiving," I concluded, my voice echoing in the confined space. The heavy stainless steel doors glided shut, effectively obscuring their horrified visages and permanently severing our ties to their noxious lineage. The descent within the elevator felt akin to awakening from a prolonged nightmare. As the illuminated floor indicators chimed softly, counting down to the lobby, the oppressive, suffocating burden that had weighed upon my chest for years dissipated entirely. I glanced down at Leo. He was gazing at the mirrored doors, his small chest rising and falling with measured, rhythmic breaths. The fear that had once clung to him had vanished. The perpetual nervousness that had emanated from him in his father's presence had completely evaporated. We emerged into the expansive marble lobby of the courthouse, passing the security checkpoints and armed guards. I pushed open the imposing glass exit doors, stepping out into the brilliant afternoon sun. The crisp autumn air brushed against my face, feeling remarkably pure and invigorating. The city teemed with life around us. Taxis blared their horns, business professionals hurried along the sidewalks with their coffee cups, and tourists marveled at the soaring skyscrapers. It was but a typical Tuesday for the rest of the world, yet for us, it marked the definitive commencement of an entirely new existence. The stark contrast between the somber, toxic courtroom we had just vacated and the vibrant, living city before us was profoundly striking. For years, I had meticulously cultivated my corporate real estate enterprise in strict secrecy, living in fear that Bradley would discover it and exploit his family's wealth to seize it from me. I had concealed my success and influence to maintain a semblance of peace, but standing here in the clear daylight, I understood that I would never have to hide again. We descended the broad concrete steps of the courthouse, moving away from the imposing stone columns and the heavy architectural grandeur. I guided Leo towards a secluded, sun-drenched plaza just off the main thoroughfare, nestled amongst towering maple trees in the process of shedding their vibrant orange and gold foliage. We paused beside a modest stone fountain, its gentle murmur effectively muffling the city's persistent clamor. Releasing his hand, I knelt, bringing myself to his eye level. Leo met my gaze, his bright, perceptive eyes scanning my face for any lingering trace of menace. "Mom," he began, his voice quiet yet remarkably steady. "Are we finally safe? Is he truly gone for good?" I extended my hands to gently rest on his shoulders. "Yes, sweetheart," I affirmed, my voice imbued with unwavering certainty and profound love. "We are entirely safe. The judge has ensured he can never approach us again. He cannot contact you. He cannot threaten you. And he cannot compel you to return to that dreadful house. We are completely free." Leo exhaled a lengthy, shaky breath and, without preamble, wrapped his arms tightly around my neck, burying his face against my shoulder. I embraced him with equal fervor, closing my eyes and resting my cheek against his soft hair. For the first time in years, the incessant need to watch my back or brace for another vicious legal assault had vanished. The paralyzing anxiety that had resided in my gut for a decade was irrevocably eradicated. I drew back just enough to meet his gaze directly. "You need to understand something of immense importance, Leo," I conveyed, ensuring each word resonated. "What you accomplished last night required more courage than most men will ever muster in their lifetimes. You were confined with a tormentor intent on intimidating you into submission, yet you did not falter. You resisted with the unvarnished truth. You saved yourself and, by extension, you saved me today. I am immeasurably proud of you." A genuine, radiant smile finally illuminated Leo's face. He brushed away a single errant tear, standing a fraction taller. As we stood there, basking in the pleasant warmth of the afternoon sun, I heard the deliberate cadence of approaching footsteps on the concrete path. Turning, I observed Terence making his way towards the parking garage. He had dispensed with his tie and unbuttoned the top button of his meticulously tailored shirt, appearing utterly fatigued, yet profoundly relieved. The oppressive weight of his discordant marriage had officially been lifted. Terence moderated his pace as he noticed us by the fountain. He refrained from encroaching upon our private moment but paused briefly. His dark eyes met mine, reflecting a deep, shared understanding of the ordeal we had both just endured. He then shifted his gaze to Leo. "You are an exceptionally courageous young man, Leo," Terence stated, his deep voice carrying an unmistakable tone of profound respect. "Never allow anyone to suggest otherwise. Cherish your mother." Leo offered a polite nod. "Thank you, sir," he responded. Terence looked back at me, eschewing any platitudinous well-wishes or dramatic farewells. He offered instead a warm, sincere smile and a resolute nod of mutual acknowledgement. It was the unspoken recognition of two survivors who had successfully dismantled a corrupt establishment, emerging from its ashes entirely unscathed. I returned his nod, watching him turn and proceed towards his vehicle, irrevocably leaving the toxic legacy of his former in-laws behind. I rose and took Leo's hand once more. The air felt lighter, the sun warmer, and the future lay entirely open for us to shape. We had but one final matter to attend to before true celebration could commence. We stood together near the small stone fountain for a few more moments, allowing the cool, crisp autumn breeze to dispel the last lingering shadows of the morning. The heavy, oppressive atmosphere of the courthouse was now definitively behind us. As we observed the water cascading over the stones, a large, completely blacked-out luxury SUV smoothly glided to the curb a short distance away. Its heavy tires crunched softly upon the fallen golden leaves. My private chauffeur, a kindly, distinguished gentleman named Harrison, promptly exited the vehicle. He circled to the passenger side and opened the robust armored door for us, offering a warm, professional smile. "Good afternoon, Miss Natalie," Harrison greeted, his voice a comforting, deep resonance. "Good afternoon, Leo. I trust today's legal proceedings concluded as anticipated." "They concluded absolutely flawlessly, Harrison," I replied, guiding my son towards the waiting vehicle. "Our business here is definitively concluded. You may take us home." Leo settled into the spacious, immaculate leather interior, and I took the seat beside him. The heavy doors sealed shut, instantly muting the cacophonous din of the bustling city exterior. For the preceding 3 years, I had compelled myself to engage in a highly strategic and perilous game of chess. I had ostentatiously driven a decade-old rusted rental sedan. I had utilized a cramped, dilapidated apartment in an undesirable neighborhood as an anonymous mailing address. I had permitted my ex-husband, his new, arrogant wife, and his malevolent, toxic family to believe I was utterly destitute and struggling for survival. This deception was a calculated maneuver to safeguard my corporate assets and ensure my peace of mind, while I covertly constructed my real estate empire. However, as I settled into the plush, heated leather seating, I knew the pretense was over. The mask was permanently removed. As Harrison smoothly departed from the curb and merged into the vibrant downtown traffic, my cell phone began to vibrate within my tote bag. I retrieved it and checked the caller identification. "Good afternoon, Natalie." David's voice, crisp and impeccably professional, resonated through the opulent cabin of the luxury vehicle. "I apologize for the intrusion, but I wish to personally brief you on the situation at the downtown commercial tower. Our legal department has just received official confirmation from the courthouse clerk. The emergency custody petition has been thoroughly dismissed, and the permanent restraining orders have been legally finalized." "Excellent work, David," I replied, sinking back into the plush leather headrest. "And what is the current status of the 14th floor?" "The eviction team is currently assembled in the main lobby of the glass tower, Natalie," David confirmed, consulting his logistics reports. "We have the property managers, private security contractors, and a full commercial moving crew ready to deploy. Bradley's tech startup has been virtually vacant for weeks, but there remains a substantial quantity of high-end office equipment within. We are simply awaiting your final executive order to proceed." I gazed out the tinted windows of the SUV, the cityscape of towering skyscrapers gliding past. Somewhere within those colossal structures, Bradley's specious tech venture sat in darkness, utterly devoid of funds and out of time. Meanwhile, Bradley himself was now confined to a cold concrete holding cell in the courthouse basement, perhaps finally grasping that his every boast had been reduced to ashes. "Execute the eviction immediately, David," I commanded, my voice a chilling monotone of absolute resolve. "Padlock the main double doors, revoke all their keycard access to the corporate elevators and the private parking garage, and seize every last piece of office equipment, all the high-end computers, the luxury furniture, and the server racks to offset his substantial unpaid rent balance. If anyone remains in that office, have private security escort them from the building without delay. Leave absolutely nothing behind." "Understood completely, Natalie," David replied without hesitation. "The locks will be changed, and the assets will be fully seized within the hour. Congratulations on a total victory today. Enjoy your weekend with your son." I ended the call and returned the phone to my bag. The ultimate sweet revenge was finally realized. I had not merely triumphed over my abuser in court. I had systematically dismantled his entire fraudulent empire, stripped away his fabricated wealth, exposed his massive financial crimes to federal authorities, and secured my child's absolute, unquestionable freedom. I turned to Leo. He was gazing out the window, observing the beautiful urban panorama with an expression of serene, untroubled peace. I reached over and gently took his hand, intertwining my fingers with his. He squeezed my palm tightly, resting his head against my shoulder as the luxury SUV carried us away from the darkest chapter of our lives. We were returning to our true home, a sprawling, secure, multi-million-dollar penthouse overlooking the water, where no one would ever again be able to harm, demean, or threaten us. We had navigated the inferno of an incredibly toxic family and emerged stronger, wealthier, and completely independent. Have you ever found yourself compelled to walk away from a profoundly toxic situation and meticulously rebuild your entire existence from the ground up? Have you ever allowed a bully to underestimate you, only to then prove them utterly and delightfully wrong? I would be eager to hear your stories of resilience and triumph in the comments below. If my journey has resonated with you, please give this a like and subscribe for more narratives of strength and survival. Thank you so much for listening. And always remember that your true worth is never dictated by those who are willfully blind to your value. The most profound lesson we can glean from this entire narrative is the sheer power of silent resilience in the face of boisterous arrogance. Throughout the ordeal, the toxic family relied entirely on intimidation, volume, and fabricated realities to exert control over someone they perceived as inferior. They fundamentally mistook silence for weakness. Because Natalie did not scream, weep, or constantly defend herself against their vile insults, they arrogantly assumed she was utterly broken and powerless. However, her silence was never a concession. It was a meticulously calculated strategic preparation. We often feel an overwhelming compulsion to immediately defend our character when falsely accused or severely underestimated by the toxic individuals in our lives. Our initial instinct is to retaliate, to match their aggressive anger, or to desperately prove our worth to those stubbornly determined to misunderstand us. Yet, this story teaches us that the most devastating response to a bully is not a shouting match. The ultimate defense lies in focusing your efforts, engaging in the arduous, quiet work, and constructing a personal and financial foundation so incredibly robust that their lies simply shatter against it. Natalie did not need to convince her abusers of her success or capability. She simply gathered her undeniable evidence, built her substantial real estate empire from the shadows, and awaited the opportune moment to let the absolute truth speak for itself. Her journey serves as a reminder that true power does not require constant proclamation of its existence. It simply arrives when the time is right, irrevocably altering the landscape. Your value is never diminished by the volume of your critics or the barbarity of their pronouncements. If you are currently navigating relationships with individuals who consistently underestimate your potential, cease attempting to convince them with your words and, instead, demonstrate it through your undeniable success.